I'm Ken Fjord. Last year, I wrote a book for my son entitled The Graysonian Ethic, Lessons for My Unborn Son, in the months before he was born. Once he was born, I published the book on Amazon. He's now a happy bouncing baby, and I've decided to release the audiobook version for free on YouTube. On economics. Economics has been described as the study of incentives. People usually think of economics as directly relating to money. But money is not necessary for economics to exist. Money is essentially three things: a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. So, what does this mean? A unit of account is something that lets you consistently measure the value of a thing. For example, you can buy a new car for about $30,000 this year. You could probably go about as low as $20,000, and you could go way higher than that if you wanted to. But for a mid-range sedan, $30,000 is a legitimate value. It is because a dollar has a relatively constant value that you can say that this costs this much, because if it was changing value a lot, you would constantly have to reprice everything. Money is also a store of value because you can hang on to it, at least in the short term, and it will still be there tomorrow. In reality, the economic systems of the world have set it up so that money slowly loses value over time. About 2% per year is what they target. So you are storing value, but if you store value in cash for too long, you end up losing all of your value. For this reason, rich people do not keep their money in money. They will always keep their money in investments that they expected to grow faster than inflation. Finally, it is a medium of exchange. This just means that it is something that can be easily transferred to other people, and it is particularly important that it be accepted universally. And if it is transferred from you to another person, then you no longer have any claim to it, and the next person has sole ownership of it. Money can be a bunch of different things. It can represent resources. For example, if you have a pile of gold somewhere, you can represent buying power using a chunk of that gold, or a sheet of paper that will let you go get that gold. Our money is the opposite. It represents debt. The way the banking system works, if I borrow money from the bank, they don't actually take that money from someone else. They just change a few numbers in their system and the money comes into existence. During this time, there is more money in existence. And as I pay off my debt, the amount of money in existence slowly shrinks. It's kind of a strange thing, because if everyone were to pay off all their debts, the only money that would be left over would be a small amount of legacy money from a previous phase of an earlier monetary system. Thus, in order for money to exist, there must always be someone indebted to another, at least under our current system. Money is fantastic because it helps you facilitate transactions between people who might not otherwise have use for each other. The grocer might be 65 years old and really not care all that much about video games. But the video game developer can still go buy food because the money that they get from 20-year-olds is fully acceptable for use at the grocery store. This is one of the reasons why money is a massive economic innovation that fundamentally changed economies. You no longer need to be able to do something for person A in order to get something from person B. Without this, however, economies still exist, they are just less efficient. One of the fundamental rules of economics is called supply and demand. The idea is that the balance between supply and demand determines the value of a thing. It has to be understood that this is not like a law of physics. Right now, the largest companies on the face of the earth make massive amounts of money selling things that are basically unlimited. A lot of them work with data which is infinitely transferable and copyable. Ultimately, the value of a thing is actually the value that anyone is willing to pay for a thing. Let us talk about a scenario that does not include money. Let us say that our neighbor Bob is willing to give you a new video game if you mow the lawn for him today. There are a lot of things that could affect this. There is how valuable you consider the video game to be. If it is a new video game for game console you do not have, for example, then you are going to be less likely to want to put in a bunch of work for something that is not very valuable to you. If on the other hand, it is a video game that you do not have that is for game console that you own, and it is a game you have been excited to play, then maybe that video game is very valuable to you. Let us take a look at the other side of the equation. Let us say that you are presently bored. There is not much going on. In that case, your time probably is not that valuable to you, so giving it up does not mean a whole lot. On the other hand, let us say that right now you are about to go to a rock concert of your favorite band. Then that time is extremely valuable to you and you might not be remotely interested in parting with it. So, you can see, even though under this circumstance there is no money changing hands, economics can still apply. One of the most important pieces of economics for anybody to know is called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the idea that whenever you spend resources on one thing, it means that those resources are not available for something else. One example was seen above, where if you mow that guy's lawn, you won't be able to go to the rock concert. Even in a world of unlimited, there are still limits. Let us say that you had every single video game. You are likely to play some a lot, and others almost not at all. Your time becomes the limited resource. As you get older, you will find that this is the case more and more often, where you are deciding between multiple completely different things that you must spend your limited resources on. Knowing about this concept of opportunity cost can mean the difference between long-term success and long-term failure, because when you spend your limited resources on unimportant things, you close the door to important things. One of the most important things that you can do in your life is trying to figure out when people have misjudged the value of something. This can be a lot of different things, from people to things to investments to forms of entertainment. Being able to see that difference and acting on it early often means that you will get an opportunity to get a leg up on it before other people. It is true that sometimes the best of the best are already obvious and everyone knows it. But there is nothing quite like finding something that nobody realizes is there because they cannot see it. Picking it up and suddenly having this great thing for way under the market value because you had a better eye for it than anyone else. Traditionally, there are two separate studies of economics. Microeconomics refers to things like we have discussed so far, situations where one transaction is taking place, and the many things going on within that transaction, the forces at work. Macroeconomics refers to the study of entire economies in the aggregate. Understanding all the different little things involved with microeconomics is well beyond the scope of this particular essay, but we have already touched on some of the major concepts such as utility. Macroeconomics is generally looked at from two different standpoints. One school of economics tends to look at the macroeconomic factors as something in themselves, and analyzing those values ends up giving you data modeling. The other school of economics tends to look at macroeconomics as the sum of microeconomic transactions. There are benefits and downsides to both ways of looking at the world. The big picture economists tend to be able to tell you what's going to happen in the next couple of quarters, as long as nothing unexpected happens. The little picture economists tend to be able to tell you what that unexpected thing might be. As a millennial, I have lived through more recessions than most other generations. There was a recession in the early 1990s, one in 2000, one in 2008, and one in 2020. The big picture economists were surprised every single time, whereas the small picture economists never were. In 2000, it was obvious that the economic boom was being caused by massive amounts of spending to get past the Y2K bug, and that spending was going to end on January 1st, 2000. In 2008, there were plenty of little picture economists sounding the alarm bells about the hazards of subprime mortgage lending, and the practices that were going on that were inflating profits while massively inflating risks. Admittedly, nobody could have seen 2020 coming from an economic standpoint, because the release of a deadly virus isn't an economic event one could predict using such models. But the upcoming stagflationary recession is almost universally agreed upon by little picture economists, and almost universally denied by big picture economists. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to rationalize the two because they often tell mutually exclusive stories. They must tell mutually exclusive stories because often the little picture economists are telling us why we cannot expect the good times to last forever, or alternatively why we do not need to worry about the bad times lasting forever. There is always going to be somebody trying to sell you a free lunch. Through my lifetime, this hasn't just meant in a money sense. There have been people trying to sell all kinds of woo-woo gadgets based on the unexplained of the moment that do impossible things. Before I was born, radiation was considered the woo-woo thing of the moment. There were a bunch of businesses that sold water containing radium that claimed that drinking this radioactive substance was good for your health. In reality, radioactive substances kill you. Famously, this led to the newspaper headline "Radium Water Makes Mogul's Health Great" right up until his jaw fell off. Interestingly, radiation has been very beneficial in a lot of fields. Food that has been exposed to high levels of radiation has basically no active pathogens in it, and radiation is used in medicine to kill cancer or as a diagnostic tool. It does not cure every disease that you had. It does not randomly make you have more energy because radiation is energy, but there are uses for it. For most of my lifetime, the woo-woo thing has been quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is absurd. You spend most of your life learning Newtonian physics, which basically makes sense. In the moment that you start talking about quantum physics, all common sense goes directly out the window. The only reason that we can know that quantum mechanics works is that we can test to see if quantum mechanics works, and it does. There are very simple experiments to show things like Heisenberg's uncertainty theorem or wave-particle duality. People have taken the quantum mechanical principles that we have been able to prove with experimentation, and they have extrapolated them into promises of immortality with absolutely no basis for that. It is just wishful thinking. Likewise, there is always somebody who's telling you that all you need to do is take from somebody else, and you can get something for free. Or that there is some magic spell that you can cast to get unlimited free stuff forever. It is certainly true that for the past 10 years or so we have seen economics that just does not make any sense. But that does not mean that you can get a free lunch forever. The fact is, usually when you are trying to do something to beat the system you end up hurting a lot more later. It is like taking drugs, it feels great. But then you get addicted, and if you ever try to stop doing the drugs your body crashes. You end up suffering and maybe dying. One way to get rich quick is to sell a bunch of rubes on some scheme to get rich quick. Lots of companies rely on people who think all they need to do is sell some shampoo or some weight loss shakes, and they will be rolling in cash. Number of those people who get rich? Virtually nil. Just the people at the top who created the scheme. Do not try to get rich this way. It is usually illegal and it is always morally bankrupt. One personal example of this for me was when I graduated from high school. I graduated in 2001, and leading up to then, everyone knew that getting into computers in any form was a ticket to the easy life. I was in luck. I happened to be very good on computers. Well, there was a bubble in computers in the years leading up to the Y2K bug, and then after that the bubble popped, a lot of people were looking for work, and also a lot of that work got outsourced. There are good jobs in it, but not nearly as many as would have needed to exist to justify the hype. A lot of people were left behind to the point that lots of the chronically unemployed I knew were computer guys. The reason I put the phrase in quotes is because at the time it was said in a very non-technical way, sort of like the boomers saying my grandchild is really good on computers, while in reality they are just good on the iPad, surfing Facebook or YouTube. In the late 90s it was not quite that bad, but there was this idea out there that no matter what you were doing, if it had something to do with computers, you were going to become a multimillionaire because a bunch of executives had become multimillionaires. There are plenty of jobs that pay reasonably well that involve computers, but without being steered in the right direction, everyone was just kind of under the impression that being a computer tech could eventually lead to saving the world. In one of my recent essays, I talked about how crazy the world was back then. At that particular moment in time, things that seemed absolutely impossible were becoming possible. So people just assumed that all the rumors that they heard were true. People often end up advocating for different economic systems as a solution to our current economic problems. Do not let yourself get tricked, whether it is socialism or fascism. If your solution to all that ails the world is you need to take over the world and put me in charge, you are not an economic defender. You're a supervillain. Capitalism and liberal democracy have their problems, but one of the coolest things about them is that the freedom that they afford you allows you to create whatever you want within their systems. If you want to create a commune, buy some land and go build a commune. If you want to create a workers' cooperative, get some of your buddies together and create a workers' cooperative. The problem is when people do this, they discover that all these ideas work out way better on paper than in reality. In the 1960s, lots of people set up communes, and in spite of not using money in their utopia, there were still some people who were the leaders and everyone else were the followers, and guess who got all the nicest stuff? Guess who got all the prettiest girls? Moving on to a different topic. Do you remember when I said at the beginning of this that economics is not just about money? That even goes when you are talking about money. Our generation has been hyper-focused on who gets to be the CEO. If you were to ask based on how much people focus on it, you think that 1 in every 100 people are a Fortune 500 CEO. The reality is that to become a Fortune 500 CEO, first you usually need connections. Second, you need a fairly expensive education. Third, you need to want nothing else in your life than to be CEO. As you move up the chain of command, your level of responsibility increases more and more and more. As a frontline worker, you may be working hard, but you can also completely turn your brain off to work the moment that you leave the work site. As a supervisor, you probably need to be on call to answer questions about something when you are not on site, and you need to spend some time strategizing and figuring out how you're going to handle things beyond the hustle and bustle of that day. As a superintendent, you have to think about everything that is going on, and you have to help manage the requests from all of the guys that have been passed up through all of the supervisors. And as a manager, you might have a dozen superintendents, and you are trying to help all of those superintendents do their jobs, while the superintendents are all helping their supervisors to do their jobs, while the workers are all trying to do their jobs. When you are 15 or 20 runs up that chain of command, you get to a certain point where you do not get personal time anymore. You are always either dealing with things amongst your personnel, external forces, talking to the media, or you are doing other things. The life of a CEO is fully regimented to the minute. Most of them have very precarious family lives because they do not have the sort of time to put into their families. They do not really get to spend much time working on hobbies because they do not get vacations. Even if they are on vacation, their phone is on and they are ready to take a meeting at a moment's notice. Do you really want that? Do you really want to give up everything just so that you can oversee something important? The fact of the matter is, for most people, the answer is no. Most CEOs are a very specific type of person who want that 24/7 always on the job and are willing to make the unbelievable sacrifices to do that job. Do not be mistaken that I'm saying that these people are great people. What I'm actually saying is that for these people, the incredible cost of basically giving up their lives is worth that title of CEO and the pay packet that comes with it. Most people would be perfectly happy being the CEO for a week, maybe a year. But how about 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? The precious minutes of your life are ticking away, and you're stuck in a business meeting about the acquisition of a factory in Mongolia. Money is definitely important in life, but for most of us it is a means to an end. Mistaking money for a reason to live is tragic. Virtually everything else in life is more important than money, and money is just the way you make sure that you have all those other things in life. That brings us to debt. You have to understand what debt is. Essentially, you are spending today what you make tomorrow. If you inject nitrous oxide into a car's ignition, then you immediately get a massive horsepower boost. But it also damages the engine, so later on the car won't go as fast. Likewise, you feel rich when you are spending debt. You know that you can just buy whatever you want because the money is there. It feels great. Unfortunately, eventually the time comes that you need to pay that debt back, and that can really hurt. There have been some times that I have gotten some serious windfalls, amounts of money that should have been life-changing. They weren't, because instead of being able to spend it on something new, I had to use it to pay down my previous debts. It can be something that makes you look affluent today at the cost of making you look like a pauper tomorrow. Saving is the opposite. It makes you look like a pauper today so you can look affluent tomorrow. You have a limited lifespan, but you have a much more limited career. At this point, it is likely that almost half of your life will be spent in a state that you cannot work. It is essential that you start early saving for retirement because it is extremely likely that there won't be anything there to help you when the time comes. On a macro level, I feel that debt is the same way. Countries can spend debt for quite a long time, and there are several effects that mean that spending today really makes you look good. It's been estimated that there is a multiplier effect. That effect means that if you spend $1 of government money, there could be 2, 3, 4, 20 times that amount showing up as a GDP number. GDP is a measure of the economic action inside of an entire economy. Every time that you buy something or sell something or work, you are contributing to GDP. That number is very important because it represents the economic success of a place. People are elected or unelected based solely on this number. Kings get deposed over this number. The problem is that it cuts both ways. You end up spending today and it feels great. But at some point in the future, the time comes to pay that debt back. Incredibly, people think that we can just let this grow forever without consequence. That is simply wrong. Supply and demand as a general topic apply to both currency and debt. The value of a currency is partially represented by the amount that someone is willing to pay in other currency for that currency. If you issue a bunch of currency, then it's quite likely that the value of your currency will go down. If you find a way to pull a bunch of currency out of the market, then it's likely that the value of the remaining currency will go up. Likewise, the way that governments issue debt is to sell a piece of paper saying, "We will pay you back $100, and then they go to an auction and try to sell those pieces of paper. If there are lots of people competing for that piece of paper, then the value of each one might be close to $100. Otherwise, the amount of money that a bank or investor would have to be paid in order to lend that $100 might be way more, because there are not a lot of people with money willing to lend that money unless they know that they are going to get paid quite a bit for the trouble. So essentially, as the amount of debt goes up, the number of people willing to take on that debt will go down, until the cost of that debt starts to rise in order to attract more people to purchase it. Another thing that central banks are doing is purchasing the debt directly. This does deal with the immediate problem of the debt, and it will keep interest rates low, but it is effectively injecting money into the system, which will eventually cause the value of the dollar to drop. The point is, for both people and for nations, it feels really good to take out debt in the moment, but it feels terrible later. There are always going to be organizations trying to get you to take out more debt specifically so that they can make money off of you. But that does not mean it is a good idea. The more debt you have, the more future earnings you are going to have to give up paying it back. As I write this, we are in a moment in history where overwhelming spending has taken place, and we haven't yet seen the consequences. My response to that is the following story. The greatest recession in public memory, the Great Depression, came about in part because of a change to the Homestead Act. The change to the Homestead Act said that in order to homestead you did not need access to groundwater. Previously you needed access. At the same time, a temporary change in climate occurred, so there was a lot more rain over the prairie. As a result, for a few years people thought that perhaps the climate had changed permanently, so lots of money ended up flowing into these new farms as bank loans. Also at the same time, the Federal Reserve had been created, which provided a lender of last resort and appeared to reduce the risk of bank runs. Because of this, banks were more than happy to take what looked like a low risk and lend a whole lot of money to farmers starting up their own farms using the Homestead Act. What happened next is the climate reverted to normal, and suddenly all this prairie was trying to grow thirsty crops on plains that did not get enough precipitation to support those crops. The resulting environmental catastrophe was called the Dust Bowl, and the farm failures led to bank failures, which led to the Great Depression. The point I'm getting at here is, just because a thing that we know will be harmful hasn't been harmful yet does not mean that it won't be harmful. The last couple decades in particular have introduced a number of dangerous new financial technologies such as qualitative easing, where the central bank directly buys debt, that allow governments to artificially keep bond rates low. And so far, it hasn't caused a collapse in the value of the currencies. But just because it hasn't happened yet does not mean that the fundamental laws of economics stop existing. It is sort of like the concept of carrying capacity in environmentalism. If an island can support 100 deer, and 101 deer come to exist, there is no immediate impact. But eventually there will be no food left on that island. In the same way, I'm certain that there is going to be a spiral of debt and inflation in the relatively near future. I'm going to close this off with a tidbit talking about one of the most important things that I have seen in my life. Not making the mistake of thinking that graphs go on in the same direction forever. The idea that what happened recently will go on forever is called recency bias. And in so many ways it is the most dangerous bias there is. During the dot-com bubble there are countless companies that went up and people assumed they'd go up forever. Most of those companies no longer exist. In 2007 you could not go wrong buying Lehman Brothers. In 2008 they went out of business. Theranos was a company on the tip of everyone's tongue. Today it is gone and their CEO is in jail. The point is that past performance is no indicator of future returns, is not just a posterior covering statement. It is the truth. Like many things in economics, it goes beyond money. It can refer to the fortunes of political ideas. The religious right was the major force when I was growing up. Today it is a bit player. It can refer to people. Said the Renault's CEO was considered one of the hottest people in culture as a successful, young, beautiful woman, and now she is a laughingstock. It can refer to nations. The Soviet Union was a superpower until it collapsed, leaving a normal Russia behind. Estimating what the future may bring requires more than extrapolating the last few points on the graph. It requires insight into what's going on, and it is entirely possible to be wrong. Thanks for listening to this chapter of the Graysonian Ethic, Lessons for My Unborn Son. If you like the book and would like a physical copy or an electronic copy, please look it up. It's available on Amazon around the world. Barring that, please like and share with others. I'll be releasing one chapter every week, so if it hasn't been completely released. If you're interested in hearing more, you can subscribe to see when I post additional chapters.